Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Welcome to another episode of Weird Web Radio. I'm your host, Lonnie Scott. In this episode, we're talking to Jason Mankey. Jason is a third-degree Gardnerian High Priest, helps run 2 witchcraft covens in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife, Ari. Jason is also a popular speaker at Pagan and Witchcraft events across North America and Great Britain. He is the channel manager at Patheos Pagan, the world's most read pagan blogging site, and writes there as well on his own blog, Raise the Horns. Jason writes for the magazine Witches and Pagans. He's an author of several books, including Transformative Witchcraft, The Witch's Athame, and The Witch's Book of Shadows, as well as a co-author of The Witch's Altar with a former guest of the show, Laura Tempest Zakroff. This interview was a lot of fun. I think you're going to enjoy it. It's pretty clear that we had a great time doing it. Jason has a lot of great stories. In fact, he answers a question that he raised himself, which I think was pretty awesome and perfect. What's the most goddamn witchy thing you've ever done in your life? And I wonder what yours is too. Real quick, if you want to hear the bonus extended portion of the show, you need to go to weirdwebradio.com and click the join the membership, or go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio. $5 a month will get you into the membership level, in which you can enjoy all of the previous extended interviews I've done with my guests and all those that are upcoming in the future. Thank you again for being here. Sit back and relax and enjoy the show, my friends. Stay weird out there. Jason, welcome to Weird Web Radio. It's a really great honor to have you here, my friend.
It is a pleasure. I'm so excited to be here and to listen to myself talk for an hour.
A lot of people don't like to hear themselves talk. I'm glad you feel that way, because that's exactly what you're going to have to do while you're here.
That's right. Embrace the reality of the situation.
That's right. Well, let's dig right in before we get too far into making jokes about what it's like to hear ourselves think out loud. You identify as a witch, and I'm curious, what does the word witch mean to you?
Wow, that is a really good question, because it feels like right now we're sort of in the middle of a reevaluation of the word witch in a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
When I started in the 90s, I started with Wicca, which everyone called witchcraft. And if you were a Wiccan, you were a witch. Now there are people who get really angry about that. There's like a line in the sand. But to me, being a witch is loving the earth, loving the change of the seasons, loving magic. I think really like the thing every witch has in common with another witch is magic. For me, it's loving deity. I think I'm very, very close to the goddesses and gods that I honor in my circles. For me, another part of witchcraft that's really important is community. I have 2 great covens, and I love getting together with all of those people and raising energy and doing things that we think benefit our lives and hopefully benefit other people's lives too, because we're interested in healing the earth and social justice issues and some of those other things. So it means a whole lot of different things to me. And one of the things I love about witch is that it resonates. When I say the word witch, like I'm a witch, I feel like I'm connecting to people that came before me. I mean, and some of them are somewhat contemporary, people like Gerald Gardner or Doreen Valiente, the pioneers of modern public witchcraft. I feel like I connect to them. But I also feel like I connect to people who practiced magic in the Middle Ages, or practiced magic back in pagan antiquity in Rome and in Greece and places like that. So it connects me to things. And then I also feel like a witch is part of my identity with what I do as a pagan person.
That's quite a rounded answer and a lot to unpack there. I like that you mentioned magic as being part of witchcraft, or something that you identify and think that it ties a lot of witches together. But there is this growing sort of movement, it seems, And I don't know how long lived it'll be, but this witch aesthetic, it's all the witchcraft look without the magic. How do you feel about that being something that's sort of arisen in social media lately?
I think those people are practicing magic. When I look at the witches of Instagram hashtag and you see these, pretty laid out altars, I think that they're trying to do magic on those altars. I think that they're trying to improve their lives and better their situations, which is to me what magic is. It's really different, I think, from what I was raised on. However, the word witch has always been one that's constantly evolving. I don't think it's stuck in one place. And I, feel sort of a kinship with some of those people because I think they're trying to do things that the same kind of things I was trying to do 20 years ago. It's just that the tools have changed a little bit. And now instead of doing your witchcraft quietly in your dorm room when no one's looking, you're putting it on Instagram. And for some of us, that's really hard to wrap our heads around.
It is hard to wrap our head around sometimes, I think, but I hope the younger, newer listeners to this that are getting involved in witchcraft realize what a privilege it is to be able to be so open and public with their craft. You and I wouldn't have had that option back in the 90s, I think, even if we did have Instagram back then.
I remember though when I was a kid in my 90s, I didn't quite wear a pentagram the size of a hubcap around my neck, but I was always like, super open about it. Like, I'm doing witchcraft and I'm doing Wicca. And I was probably much louder about it than I should have been or needed to be, but I never really got into trouble. I did lose an apartment once because my landlady did not like it and kicked me out for being a witch. And I just didn't, at that point, didn't know that I could probably fight that, but I didn't think it was worth fighting really. So, we were pretty loud and proud. I mean, we're Generation X people, and to me, that was really the big sort of second flowering of witchcraft in the United States in the modern era. And not just that, but we were like super public with it and excited about it, because by then you could go to Barnes and Noble and find all the books, and the Craft movie was out. And before the internet, you could buy The Green Egg at Tower Records or other bookstores and stuff. And yeah, so I feel like we were kind of out of the closet, but not as much as people today are.
Yeah, I mean, I personally was. I've always been that weird kid, and I never had any problem being open with who I was or what I was practicing. I did suffer a little bit of violence and attacks. It's from time to time from more conservative thinking people growing up in a smaller town. But I think you get into that no matter what, people will always figure out a reason to bully. That's why I recommend anybody getting into paganism at any rate, go out there and study martial arts, learn how to punch that asshole in the face. Let's go back to your earliest beginnings. So when you got involved in witchcraft and you're starting to take your, first steps into this, what was that like for you to actually begin? What were you doing?
It's sort of a strange story because the journey kind of had different little bits to it. So I remember in the second grade, it was President's Day in Illinois, which was probably like Lincoln's birthday. And we celebrated that, so we had a day off of school. And I remember that there was the sun outside, and I went outside and I thanked Zeus for the day because I thought it was strange that no one worshipped Zeus anymore because I loved Greek mythology. So it was like my first pagan experience. And then in the summer between my 7th and 8th grade years, I picked up a Sybil Leek book. I think it was Cast Your Own Spell. And I got it from the library, and I didn't really read it, but I also checked out a lot of other books at the library, and I had to bring them all back. And my father's getting upset because I was missing one of the books. So I opened the witchcraft book up and I read a spell in the back of the book for finding a lost object. And I found the lost library book instantly. Now you would think that this would convert me to witchcraft for life because it actually worked in about 4 seconds. But instead, it scared the piss out of me. I mean, I was frightened greatly and didn't come back to it for several years after that. And I ended up like as president of my church youth group outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And I was a Republican, and these are things I'm not really all that proud of all these years later. But during that period of time, I had discovered Led Zeppelin, and I loved Led Zeppelin so much. They still are my favorite rock band of all time. And if you know anything about Zeppelin, Jimmy Page was always very interested in the occult, and he was a big Aleister Crowley person. So I was kind of interested in that to a degree because of Jimmy, but also Robert Plant, the lead singer of Led Zeppelin, was really interested in Celtic mythology. And when I was 21, I was at a mall in St. Louis, Missouri, and there was a New Age shop there. And I walked by a rack of books, and they had a book there called Celtic Magic by DJ Conway, which is a terrible book. It's absolutely one of the worst sort of intro to witchcraft books ever. But I picked it up because I thought of, like, I can get closer to Robert Plant by reading this book. And so I read the book, and it was really just sort of a Wicca 101 book, and it resonated with me. But there was a point in the book where it says Celtic Wicca and the Lady, and it was like chapter 8 or something. And I remember like dreading that chapter because I was so scared of my witchcraft experience in the 7th grade. But I got through it, and 24 hours later, I was saying my first prayer to the goddess, and I never looked back after that. So I owe DJ Conway a huge debt for her terrible book. She was a good writer. It's just the history in that book is terrible. And I spent my first couple of years as a solitary in Southeast Missouri, where I was attending Southeast Missouri State University. And then after that, I moved to Michigan, and there I started. I joined a pagan student group at Michigan State University and started hanging out with other witches from there. And that is a big factor in my life, and probably why I'm here talking to you right now. But that's the story. So there were all these little weird steps, and there was being frightened along the way and stuff.
I like that how you you have such resounding success to know that magic is real. And it scares you away from it. And you know, that's another funny thing about your story to me is, I mean, one, you're running around some of the same stomping grounds that I've grown up in and lived in. You know, I'm in Illinois. I grew up in Illinois. I've been to St. Louis and Indiana and all these other places. I can imagine where you're going, the sort of people you're encountering. And you say DJ Conway's Celtic Magic is the thing that reintroduces you to witchcraft. The very first book I ever had on anything witchcraft or pagan related was Celtic Magic by DJ Conway.
Yes.
And also found it to be terrible, but a door opener into other things.
Right. Well, crazy as it is. Back in the 90s when that book came out, it was $3.95. So if you had $5 in your pocket, you could buy a copy of Celtic Magic, which is one of the reasons I think it was so successful and popular. Was it didn't really cost anything.
You're probably right. Yeah, I can absolutely see that being the case. So you got away from DJ Conway. She got you over the hump, helped you remove your fear of witchcraft. At some point, you had to find your way to more legitimate sources, or at least things that had more historical, prevalence and authenticity. Who were those influences?
For sure. So I'm a voracious reader, and I read a lot, but strangely, like, I never read Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, until the early 2000s. So it wasn't Scott Cunningham. I had Raymond Buckland's Big Blue Book, and I went through that, though that book is not particularly practical in a lot of ways. Like, Buckland gives you instructions on how to make your own Athame out of a raw piece of iron. And while that is probably enticing to some, for me, it just seemed like something I just could not do. So the one that really helped me the most, and today all she gets is shit, and people are like, she's terrible. But Silver Ravenwolf's To Ride a Silver Broomstick was the first sort of 101 book that really, 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 I'm going to use the word really a lot, resonated with me. Her magic is practical and easy to do. She gives fairly good introductions to sort of everything that you would associate with witchcraft in the 90s. And she's also just a terrific writer. So I loved To Ride a Silver Broomstick in my early witchling years. After that, though, it was Janet and Stuart Farrar's The Witch's Bible. I loved that sort of, witchier than thou speak. I summon, stir, and call you up. That really, to me, is awesome shit. And that's kind of how I do all my rituals now. So that book had huge impact on me. So those were two that were probably the biggest. I read Doreen Valiente's is it Rebirth of Witchcraft? It was
I
her
think so.
memoir. Yeah, and I read that pretty early on. I think just a year and a half after discovering the craft, and I fell in love with that book. Just the way she wrote, so beautiful, and I felt like I was there in the moment. And it was my first introduction to figures like Gerald Gardner and Robert Cochrane, and I really liked that book. I still go back and reread that one every once in a while. Amber Kay's True Magic, which is another book that people don't talk about very often anymore. But again, it was one of those $3.95 Llewellyn books that you could buy in the 90s. And her magic in that book is really good and easy to do. And she's also another terrific writer. I guess there's this bit in True Magic where she talks about her coven going into a cave and making goddess figures out of the clay in the cave. And I thought, whoa, that sounds like the witchiest thing I've ever heard of in my whole goddamn life. You know, so that resonated with me too. Later, Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon was a big deal for me. I love Triumph of the Moon. There are people who really hate it because it doesn't give them the history that they want, but the whole part that sort of leads up to Gerald Gardner, where Hutton talks about why we use certain language to describe the horn god or why we use certain language to describe the goddess, is just really eye opening. And not only that, but it leads you down different pathways. Like it makes you want to read 19th century Romantic poetry and things of that nature. So I got a lot out of that book.
That's cool. Now, looking back over all those things, do they stand the test of time? Would you recommend someone who's completely new to coming into witchcraft to read those books still today?
Yes. I went back and reread Broomstick maybe a couple of years ago. And I reread that and I looked at Cunningham's Solitary Practitioner and Buckland's Big Blue Book. And I felt like Ravenwolf's book held up better than the other two by a huge margin. The things that she said about deity I thought resonated better. The spellcraft was better. I thought the writing was better. I really, really felt that book held up. And The Witch's Bible still holds up if you're really looking for that sort of British traditional Wiccan witchcraft sort of flavor to things. I think there are parts of The Witch's Bible that Janet is probably no longer agrees with when it comes to some of the ideas about sexual polarity and male female stuff. And it's some of the things in there are really, really focused on that. And to some people, that's a real turnoff, and I understand that. And I think if that book had been written today, it would have been written in a different way. But other than that, it really still holds up.
Okay. Now, you dropped a phrase in there that I think is a perfect fuel for a question to shoot right back at you. You said that in Amber Kay's book, they went into a cave and made these goddess figurines out of the clay, and I believe the quote should be the witchiest goddamn thing you've ever heard of. So,
Right.
Jason, what's the witchiest goddamn thing you've ever done?
Wow, that's a really great question. There are a few moments in my life as a witch, though they're nothing like making goddess figurines out of clay in a cave. that stand out the most. That for whatever reason, these moments are the ones that have resonated with me the most, and they're the ones that I kind of come back to, and I try to not necessarily recreate that experience, but have a similar experience. So the first one was when I saw a high priestess draw down the moon. And this was at a Samhain ritual when I lived in Michigan. It was my second year of working with a college student group, and we were all very excited because our Samhain ritual was going to be super serious. We were going to use a ritual mostly from Janet and Stuart Farrar's A Witch's Bible, and everyone had to wear black because that's how you could tell that we were serious. Everyone had to wear black to the ritual. And for the most part in that group, I led a lot of the rituals, but this one I had very little to do with, which was nice. So we get there and we do the ritual, and we're casting the circle and calling the quarters and things. And then the high priest draws down the goddess, and this is his wife, and it's someone I'd known for a couple of years by that point. And they draw down the goddess, and then all of a sudden, I swear that this woman's skin was glowing in the darkness. It was like she'd swallowed 12 glow sticks, and all of that was like shining through her. It was eerie and awe-inspiring, a little bit terrifying if I, if I admit it, because I'd read about drawing down the moon, and I felt like the deities that I was honoring were real and definitely a part of my life. But to feel the power of the goddess in that way, it was I was just awestruck. It was just such a big deal in my life. And we were stupid witchling kids and didn't know what to do with the drawn down goddess. So we put a veil over her head and told her to go sit in the corner.
What?
Which is not what which is not what you do, really. But it's what we did because we didn't know what we were doing. And during the ritual, she looked at me like I made eye contact with her for like just a few seconds. And I was afraid that she was like going to jump up and yell fraud, like you've never truly believed in me until this moment. And she didn't do that though, and she just nodded and then broke off the eye contact, and I was really relieved. But drawing down the moon experiences have just been phenomenal for me, and I do those in my house now. It's something else. Like, I've been married to my wife for 15 years, and we were together for 6 years before that. So we've been together a long time. And to watch her draw down a goddess and then change completely in front of me is one of the most amazing things. It's like the cadence of her words are different, how she speaks is different, how she carries herself is different. The power in the circle, you can feel it. Everything is different and transformed. Amazing. So that's sort of the first big experience that sticks out to me. And to me, that's goddamn witchcraft, when you can have a goddess in your circle and she can kiss you on the mouth or give you a hug or whisper into your ear. I mean, that's, it gives me shivers. It's exciting. It should be something that people want to try and experience. And then I'm a Gardnerian witch, and when I was initiated into Gardnerian craft, that night is like the second biggest night of my witch life. It was, I can't like say everything about it because you're under oath and all of that.
Sure.
But how I looked at the world was different after that night. I remember 2 weeks or so after our ritual, and it was probably like the end of March or beginning of April, and this is when we lived in Michigan. And Michigan during that time of year, it's not spring-like. It's still really freaking cold and miserable and gray. And I'm walking around the neighborhood with my wife, and she says, "Jason, does everything look different?" And I looked at her like, "What do you mean?" And she's like, "It was like before our initiation, everything was in black and white, and now it's in color." And I just thought that was such a profound statement, because whatever happened during that initiation changed how we look at the world. It changed us as people, and that's the kind of effect it had on us. So to me, to have a ritual of that much power and impact is, WAF. witchy as fuck, I guess, right? I mean,
Hey,
to me,
right.
that's what witchcraft is supposed to do: transform you, make your world different, make you a different and a better person. So those two moments, more than anything else, were kind of the big ones. The you know the initiation, as again, I can't say everything about it, but I've always loved that sort of British traditional witchcraft style. The you know watchtowers, I summon, stir, and call you up, and then to finally be in a circle that did ritual. I can neither confirm nor deny, but kind of did ritual in that sense was a big deal. It was a really highlight of a witchy moment for me.
Yeah, I know you. You said that you are part of Gardnerian Witchcraft. Oh, of all the flavors of witchcraft that are available, what do you think it is about Gardnerian that not only led you there but keeps you there?
I think it connects me to the past in a way. I feel like I'm connected to Gardner and Valiente and everyone who's ever cast a Gardnerian type of circle. There's an energy to those rituals that's different from the energy of our eclectic rituals. And I can really feel that difference. I love both things. We have two covens. They're both really valuable to us. They're both really important to us. I would never say one is better than the other. They're just different. But there's something unique about the energy signature of a Gardnerian circle that I've never found in any other spot. So I come back to that. It's also just sort of smaller and more intimate. And there is something really cool about doing a ritual and being a part of a group that, you have to be secretly initiated to get into and stuff. For some people, that doesn't matter. But for some other people, I think, you know, it plays with your mind in a way that makes the magic and what you're doing a little bit more powerful.
It does. I agree. I'm not a Gardnerian, but I have some of those secret initiations that it does play with your mind. Um, how should I say this? It also carries a sort of risk with it, I think, too. Like, what have you ever been part of something that involved that level of intimacy in initiation that later you had to break away from in a way that maybe you didn't want to?
I don't think that's ever happened to me. However, I've been a part of pagan groups or pagan communities that kind of break down for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always sad to see and to have it go on around you. Before, when I lived in Michigan, we had like this great pagan community. It was, sometimes as big as 50 or 60 people in a small city of like 120,000. So it wasn't like it was this big, big population area. But we had this pretty big community, but we weren't like a coven or anything like that. We didn't meet very often. We got together for Beltane's, and we got together for Jason and Ari's Halloween party. Like we all kind of did our separate things, and every once in a while, someone would have a ritual or whatever. And then it was a pretty, but we always kind of came back together. We went to festivals together. We really liked each other, and we hung out socially, but we didn't have like big, like ritual groups from it. But then towards the end of my time in Michigan, a few people from that group all became druids, and I didn't really have much interest in being a druid. And so, like, the witches went their way, and then the people who became druids kind of went their way. We were still friends, but it was different all of a sudden. But we
Mm-hmm.
didn't break any oaths or have any giant falling outs. I still talk to all those people, but we
Good.
just didn't do as much stuff together as we used to. Yeah, I guess we've been really lucky in that sense that we haven't had giant witch wars involving people that we've circled with.
Right. That it's
Most of that's probably due to Ari because she, she keeps me in line.
well, good for her.
Yeah.
Uh, um, you know, another thing about Gardnerian witchcraft, I think there's been quite a lot written about it over the years, and information is readily accessible for people probably to learn at least enough about it to know if they want to pursue more and find a coven. Um, But thinking, I don't want you breaking oaths or anything, of course, but does anything come to mind about Gardnerian witchcraft, your experience in the covens, all the years you've been practicing, that might surprise people to know?
I think there are still a good amount of secrets within it. I mean, you can go online and read things that are the Gardnerian Book of Shadows, but I don't think I'm breaking any oaths to tell you that that's not what my BOS is like, and that's not necessarily what my BOS says. So I think there are still secrets. I think we feel like we live in an era where there aren't any secrets, but I think there still are. And I have people who will talk to me about Gardnerian witchcraft, and they're like kind of elbowing me in the side, like, haha, I know everything and stuff. I'm like, you really don't. And I'm glad that you're excited about it and that you care about it and that you want to talk to me about it, but you really don't know as much as you think that you do.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the fact that there are still secrets, I think, is probably the thing that would surprise people the most. I mean, I'm not saying that they're big earth-shattering secrets or anything, but most people over the years have taken their oaths of secrecy pretty seriously and respect them, and that's why there's still a little bit of mystery to it. I'm always kind of weird when it's always weird to me a little bit when I talk about Gardnerian craft. It's important to me, and I'm not ashamed of it, and I love it. But I also don't want anyone to think that I ever speak for all Gardnerians because I'm more public than some people. I'm sure there are a lot of Gardnerians who hate me. So,
If
I
nobody
just want
hates
to
you,
throw
you're
that
not
out
doing
there that
much.
I'm not exactly. If you don't have a couple of critics, you're not really trying hard enough.
That's right. Now, outside of Gardnerian witchcraft, what other sorts of magic and paganism are you interested in or include as part of your practice?
As I said, my wife and I are pretty big into deity. And while I would not call myself a devotional polytheist, and there are people today who readily identify primarily as devotional polytheists, to me, honoring the deities that are a part of our household and a part of our lives is a really important part of our practice. There's an altar on top of the bar to Dionysus, and he always gets the best whiskey and he always gets the best wine as an offering. And paying devotions is really it's important to me, but it's more than that. I get something out of it. I feel good giving him a sip of fantastic scotch or pouring him some of our anniversary wine that we got out of a Napa or something. That's important. So the honoring of the gods is a big deal in our household. I used to kind of be a Greek reconstructionist. I love the Greek gods most of all, but I find that the ritual doesn't resonate for me necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of quit doing that. I was doing it for a little while, but it just doesn't work as much. I just feel like it's fine just to leave them libations and give them honor, and they seem to be just fine in my Wiccan circle. So I don't feel like I have to practice like it's the year 2500 BCE or something.
Very valid argument there. That I've never been quite sure why people want to poke holes in any practice that gives others meaning until the gods themselves show up and tell me to stop doing it the way I'm doing it. I'll just keep doing whatever brings me personal meaning.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if we believe that the gods have agency, which is a word that a lot of people use, we have to assume that if you're worshiping them or honoring them in a specific way, that if they had a problem with that, they would let you know.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, if they have agency, they can step in and say, no, this isn't really the appropriate way to honor me. But if you feel called to honor them in a certain way, I think that's probably their doing.
Yep, I agree. With deity being an important part of your practice, what do you see as the nature of the gods themselves? You want to unpack that big question?
That's a big, that's a big question.
Yeah. We'll start with where, on the spectrum of, isms, I guess, polytheist and duotheist and all the variations in between, where do you sit?
I think of myself as a polytheist. However, if you look at history, you can see certain connections between certain deities. So, like, if you go back to the Indo-Europeans, and Indo-European is not a race; it's just a language.
Mm-hmm.
And the Indo-Europeans were herders, and they went all over Asia and Europe, and like the Celtic deities come from Indo-European practices. The Greeks gods come from Indo-European, and the Norse gods all come from Indo-European. So Odin and Zeus all kind of had the same dad in a historical way of speaking. So are the gods all separate entities, or are they connected in some sort of weird web that we don't understand? So a lot of my friends tell me that I'm a soft polytheist because I believe that they're probably connected in some way. But I think that's what history tells us, that there are connections there. Woden and Odin are obviously connected in some ways. Aphrodite and Venus are obviously connected in some ways. And there are some polytheists, though, who'll say, like, maybe they're connected, but they're still very independent, unique deities. And sometimes I'm not sure of that. I don't know. I think that we have to assume that the nature of deityhood is something bigger than we are, and maybe we'll never quite understand it necessarily. I don't like to tell anybody they're right or wrong when it comes to how they interpret deity. You know, there's what matters, I guess, is whatever interpretation works for you, and as long as it's compatible with whatever that you're honoring. You know, I believe in the horned god, for instance, even though I know that history tells me there was never one horned god. There were lots of different horned and antlered deities, and they were all very different in a lot of ways. But when I'm in ritual and somebody goes, you know, I call up the horned god, and there's still something there. I don't know, maybe it's just Kronos or Pan on their own, but sometimes I feel like it's a part of something that's bigger than those specific deities that has chosen to be here at this particular moment in time. I don't know, like anyone who thinks that they have all the answers to deity, those are the people I'm most skeptical of. Just because every time, you know, I think about it, it just brings up more questions in my mind. And I would never tell anybody that they're wrong, but you know, it's, you know, anytime I've ever read an argument one way or the other, I can always find something that would immediately deconstruct that argument.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I know exactly how you feel. It's interesting you brought up Odin and Woden. That's always the example that I use. You know, there's the more Proto-Germanic Wodenaz, and then the more Anglo-Saxon Woden, the Scandinavian Odin, and they're all the same. I think they're all the same force being recognized. And I probably lean more in your side of that argument with a softer sort of polytheism, because when I think about the gods, I recognize that their names and the expressions that they're honored that way are a culture and a people's way of expressing it through their language. So when we're arguing over what the gods are, we're often arguing linguistics, not necessarily the force that's tied to that language.
Yeah, it's so, you know, it's so hard to unpack, and it's such a complicated question. It's always a great question, but it's really a hard one to answer. I'm writing a Horn God book right now, and it's a lot more difficult than I thought it would be, because to me, Pan is not Kronos. They're very, very different deities. And yet, when we think of the Horn God, we often think of those two particular deities maybe more than any others. And, you know, I have friends who are like, you know, I don't believe in a bigger horn God. I only believe in the, you know, particular deities. And like the language of writing the book has been more challenging than I thought it would be, because I want to honor all of these different interpretations through the course of 60,000 words or whatever it is.
I can't imagine anything more maddening than trying to make everyone happy, but I wish you luck.
Yeah. I'm going to fail spectacularly and make sure that no one is happy. That's probably what will happen.
And perfect. You'll probably do something of value then. After all these years of practicing witchcraft and magic, what is it that you still hope to achieve going forward?
Wow. I don't ever think of, wow, I want to achieve anything. It's just sort of what I do. It's just a part of me. It's like hard to imagine a life without those components in it. It would just be a life not worth living as much. I do think it's important to pass on what I've learned and what I've done. I think that if you're going to start a coven or you're going to call yourself a high priestess or a high priest, I think giving back is really, really important in that sense. And that you should endeavor to share your craft and what you do with people who are interested in it. I don't think that we should ever really proselytize. But at the same time, if people are out there and need to find you, then you should make yourself somewhat available so that they can. So hopefully, I can pass on the things that I've written and the things that I've learned and leave a small legacy behind in that sense. But I don't think, like, wow, I need to go out and conjure the Scarlet Woman or something. Like, if I don't do that, like, my life as a magician will be incomplete.
Yeah, well, people who do that end up exploding in laboratories, so don't do it.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
We love a Jack.
Yeah. Well, one thing you've done and you continue to do is write books and contribute your accumulated wisdom and knowledge of your practice, so others can benefit from it. What is it that drives you to keep writing?
Wow. So for me, when I write a book, it's usually because I feel like there's an area of witchcraft or paganism that has not yet been fully explored, and I want to spend some time exploring it. So the book Transformative Witchcraft, which came out in January of 2019, is a book that I'm really proud of, and I worked on it for several years. And it really talks about 5 things. It talks about whether Gerald Gardner was initiated into witchcraft back in 1939, the cone of power, drawing down the moon, the great rite, and initiations and elevations. And especially the last 4 things, the cone of power, drawing down the moon, initiations, and the great rite, those were all things that had not really been explored in much depth in a lot of books. I remember like reading my early witchcraft books for covens, and they would say things like, and now build the cone of power. And then there would be a period. And then it would just go on with whatever else they wanted you to do in the ritual. And they wouldn't tell you what the cone of power was or how to build the cone of power. It was just assumed that you knew. And I'm like, well, this is a 101 book. The whole point of having this book is because I don't know, right? And so I remember one night I was walking with my wife, and I was like, you know what I want to do in coven one of these nights is I want to build the cone of power. And she's like, looked at me and she goes, what the hell are you talking about? We do that every time we're in circle together. And I was like, really? Because, it just always felt like some sort of great mystery to me because no one had ever explained it. So I spent 25,000 words talking about energy and how to build the cone of power and what it is, because I felt like those questions hadn't been answered yet. And it also, for initiation, to me, that was this huge life-changing experience. And every once in a while, you read about it in books, like, here's an initiation ritual. But they don't tell you why you should have an initiation ritual or what the different components of an initiation ritual are. So I wanted to spell those things out a little bit better. So that book was all about answering questions that I had and exploring things a little bit more in depth and looking at historical stuff and whatever else. The next book that I have coming out is called The Witch's Wheel of the Year, and it's a book about ritual. It's about the many different kinds of ritual. One of the things about witch ritual is that there's 3 different sort of kinds of witcheral. I think I'm going to start using that word of ritual. And so there's solitary ritual, and we all know what a solitary ritual is. It's basically by yourself. But then there's a coven ritual, which is a ritual for maybe 8 to 20 people, maybe even 5 people, but it's a small, intimate ritual. And then there's in the book what I call circle rituals, which are large group ritual. And all of them require different skills and different ways of doing things. The ritual that works for your coven is not going to work for 100 people sometimes, because what you have to focus on in a group of 100 is just different or bigger. So I wanted to write a book kind of exploring those differences. And then also, I think a lot of ritual and witch books is bad. Like the early books that we grew up in the 90s, I know especially, and the ones in the 70s before that were even worse. Like the rituals don't have anything for you to do. I remember reading Raymond Buckland's Sabbath rituals in the Big Blue Book, and it's basically just coveners yelling at each other, doing nothing. I mean, I feel like we've progressed as ritualists, and we're much better at doing rituals now than we used to. And I mean, because when we're starting in the 50s and 60s, I mean, this is all new, and we're actually kind of building this infrastructure. But I think we've gotten better. So I wanted to release a book that had what I thought were really good rituals that people could use. So that was my motivation in writing that book. Better rituals, how to do the rituals, what are the components of rituals, provide people sort of a better mousetrap to take back to their communities and to put into their personal practice. I think we often underestimate the power of large open public rituals. For a lot of people, that's their first sort of step into a greater pagan and witch community, are those open public circles. And if those rituals are not good, people aren't going to come back to our open public circles. So I wanted to write a book that would hopefully make sure that people came back to those spaces.
That's really that's an incredible insight into, I think, public rituals for sure. I'm part of ADF Grove, pretty sizable grove in Champaign, Illinois, and we hold public rituals around the entire wheel of the year, and they're very well run, and they're done very good. I think that's part of why people keep coming back, and the group keeps growing, more interest keeps building into it. But I've been to those duds, and I've seen how that can have an effect on driving people away who are just sort of curious.
Yeah, we have a responsibility, I think, when we do large open ritual. We have a responsibility to our traditions, we have a responsibility to our communities, and we have a responsibility to whatever higher powers we're honoring in that particular ritual. And if we don't do a good job, if we don't live up to it, then we're disappointing ourselves and those other things. And I think it's great that you live in Champaign, because that is where my father was born, and it's where my grandparents lived, and so it's sort of like the family seat of our family.
That's cool. Yeah, I don't live in Champaign. I live south of Champaign, about 40 miles in Mattoon, in case anybody needs to come stalk me.
Mattoon, I know Mattoon. I know Mattoon.
Your book, The Witch's Wheel of the Year, I'm sure you're covering some of the holidays and things that go around in what's known as the Wheel of the Year, yes?
Yeah, so there's 3 rituals for every Sabbath, and then there's the circle ritual for large groups, coven ritual, and the solitary. But then each section for each Sabbath is introduced with sort of a history of the Sabbath. That was harder to write than most people probably think it was harder to write, because for me, what's really important is how we celebrate the Sabbaths today and how they were celebrated in ancient times, if they actually existed in ancient times. Because some of the Sabbaths, especially the equinoxes, they did not exist until we created them as holidays. Obviously, the equinoxes existed, but there were no ancient witches celebrating Ostara. There were no ancient witches celebrating Mabon. And, those are kind of modern names for the equinoxes. And I think some people don't know that, or just assume that all of these things are really ancient and legitimately old. And those ones are not necessarily. So I wanted to write about the Sabbaths and the histories of the Sabbaths, but also not get bogged down in other things. Sometimes, like if we talk about a Sabbath like Samhain or Yule, what we end up talking about is Halloween and traditions that sort of revolve around Christmas. Like no one who celebrated Samhain 2,000 years ago was lighting a jack-o'-lantern, right? I mean, that's a modern Halloween thing. It's not necessarily a Samhain thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to write kind of good historical introductions to the Sabbats without bogging people down in like thousands and thousands of words. So yeah, so there's a lot of that in there.
Good. You brought up Samhain, and I'm glad you did, because, as we're recording this right now, Samhain's a couple weeks away. By the time this episode is released to the public, Samhain will have been passed by a couple weeks, more than likely. This is going to be released sometime in mid-November. But I was thinking about this, knowing that I was going to talk to you and you had this book. The Sabbats and the high days are often in an event unto itself. There's a lot of build up towards it. There's, especially for the people who are planning the ritual and getting that all together, there's the ritual itself. And then everyone goes their way, whatever they're going to do. I never really see much about, now it's been a couple weeks since Samhain. How do we reflect on Samhain itself, the pattern of energy? How much influence does what Samhain really means still influence us after the event has passed a few weeks later?
I think we often tend to look at the Sabbats as isolated days, like today I'm celebrating Imbolc or whatever, but to me, the Sabbats in a lot of ways are a season. And, when it comes to Samhain, it's something that I feel start at the end of September. I think there's something very real about the veil between the worlds thinning. Things just feel different. And I think that energy carries on into November. I think that energy even kind of carries on until Yule, maybe even until early January. I think that the veil remains thin at that particular period of time. And if you think about holidays, especially in America, we only really celebrate holidays in a big way a couple times a year, and most of them are all in the fall. I mean, there's something about Samhain and Yule in particular, and I think that's because we are closer, not just to the dead, but to the spiritual world and magical entities and things. We don't often think of Yule as being a magical time as witches, but when I look at Yule, I mean, there's the Krampus running around and Santa Claus running around and Befana, the Italian Christmas witch. I mean, there's something in the air then that is really magical, and I think that gateway starts to open in September and October. I mean, I've done Samhain rituals as late as November 15th, and they still feel vital and fresh, and they don't feel out of place. I mean, I think sometimes, like, like if you're celebrating the spring equinox on April 5th, I mean, and maybe it doesn't feel right because it feels like there's already kind of a transition in those couple of weeks. But at this time of year, October, November, even parts of early December, they all kind of flow into one another. And so I don't think that once Samhain's over, you should take down the pictures of your beloved dead and those that you've lost and pack them away. Well, the veil's no longer thin. I think it's still thin. I think it's still a time to have those experiences with the dead and to honor the dead and to feel them close to you.
Yeah, I agree. I think of them more as seasons as well. And I tell you, in heathen traditions, Yule is more akin to what people think of as Samhain. So you're spot on when you say that there's this magical thing in the air that just carries through this entire part of the year. I absolutely agree.
A lot of our Halloween traditions were actually kind of stolen from Yuletide traditions too. I mean, trick or treating is really just sort of an alternative form of wassailing. It still has the placating people, and if they're not placated, they're going to vandalize your house, which was exactly what wassailing was. I think it was just slotted at Halloween because it ended up making more sense there than maybe in December when you would have to trudge through the snow. And for a long time, Yuletide was when people told ghost stories. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was considered one of the scariest times of all.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is to me, like, all of this is a big season. When somebody says, we're celebrating the holidays, to me those holidays really begin at Halloween. They don't begin at Thanksgiving. They begin a month before
Yeah,
that. So I do have to change the light along the way. The orange lights don't work as well in December.
Speak for yourself, crazy person. No.
That's true.
Yeah, I recommend people, if this seems new to you somehow, this concept that we're talking about, go, just when you're done listening to the show, just grab your computer, your phone, whatever, and type in Christmas ghost stories, and you'll see this rich history of tradition of ghost stories that were much more closer to Christmas than they were to Halloween.
Yeah. I mean, even, Christmas Carol, which, we kind of take for granted today because it's, been told so many times and there's 8,000 different versions of it, but it's a ghost story. It's the ghost of Christmases past, present, and yet to come. I mean, Dickens wrote it as a ghost story, so our most familiar Christmas story, screw Jesus, the most familiar Christmas story is the Dickens story, and it's a ghost story.
Nice. Okay. This is a perfect segue too, by the way. People listen to the show know what's coming. I like to talk about ghosts. So, Jason, have you ever experienced a haunting?
So, all right, ghost story. So, I truly believe in ghosts, and I had a very real physical encounter with a ghost. Something happened that I will never forget, and it cemented my belief in ghosts. So, in college in Missouri, I lived in a giant old house for a while, and it was a house that had been built over 100 years ago. We think it was probably built in like the 1850s, 1860s. It had a carriage house in the back. That's how big this particular house was. And there was something about that house where lights would just sort of randomly turn on and turn off for no particular reason. So we all assumed that the house was haunted, that there must have been a ghost of some sort in there. So it's July in Missouri, and this is in a city called Cape Girardeau, which was built on a swamp next to the Mississippi River. So it's extremely humid, and at that time of year in Missouri, it's also really, really hot outside. So it's one of those days where the heat index was up at about 100 degrees, and at night it doesn't cool off because of the humidity. It just stays in the like low 80s or low to mid 90s, and it was one of those nights. It was super super hot in our house, and we weren't doing anything. And one of my friends said, "Hey, we should have a séance to talk to the ghost in the house." And they said, "Well, Jason, you're the one who's into all the weird stuff. You should lead the séance." So I said, "Sure, I'll lead the séance." So I started by casting a circle because the idea of talking to a ghost, if you think about it, is a little frightening. And I wanted to control the situation. So I cast a circle, and then I started talking to the ghost inside the house, and I gave it permission to enter the circle. And we're sitting in our dining room, and there weren't a lot of windows in that room, and this house certainly did not have air conditioning. And we're all holding hands, and as soon after I said you can come into the center of our circle, I felt this icy cold touch crawl over my wrist. And the guy whose hand I was holding next to me, he said, "Oh my God, did you feel that?" Because he felt it too. And I'll never forget that touch. I mean, it was like someone had taken an icicle and rubbed it on my wrist. It was so cold, and there was no rational explanation for that cold coming there. And it was just right after we said, "Come into the middle of our circle." So then, we asked the ghost a couple of questions or something, and I swear that I saw like this blobby energy in the middle of our table where we were all holding hands in the circle, and then that energy just kind of dissipated and went up and out of the circle, and we never had the lights turn off and on ever again in the house. But that's my real ghost story. But that physical touch of that icy cold touch, oh
Yeah.
it was cool, but also really scary at the
It
time.
removes room for doubt when you feel something like that. That's for sure. Now,
It does.
yeah, I mean, you've got a lot more years of witchcraft and magic practice behind you now. You've even been part of, I mean, drawing down the moon rites are, in essence, possession rites. You're quite familiar and comfortable around spirit activity on some degree. If somebody comes to you and says, Jason, I know you're a witch. I need help. Shit's gone wild in my house. I don't know what the fuck to do. What are you going to do to help them?
You know, I'd probably tell them to talk to my wife, who's better at that stuff than I am. But you know, we've cleansed a lot of houses over the years. So here's a story. Like we lived in Michigan and we bought a house in Michigan, and apparently there had been a stabbing in our basement
Oh,
of the house that we bought, and there was this really icky energy down there. And Ari got a crystal. She was going to put all of that negative energy in this crystal that she had, and then she was going to go bury it outside. So uh, she absorbed the negative energy in the crystal, and the crystal became literally hot to the touch. And then she buried it in our backyard. And the next morning, it had been unearthed and come out of the hole that she dug in the backyard. Um, yeah. So we called one of our friends in who's a ceremonial magician to see what he could do. And we were awoken that morning to him doing the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram in our basement, which kind of scared us because we weren't expecting him. He just came in and started working. And then he threw the crystal in a river because we just couldn't get it cleansed
oh, that poor
after it had
river.
absorbed the bad energy. Yeah,
Yeah.
but so usually when we find a situation like that, what we want to do is we want to use something that's going to absorb the negative energy and get it out of the place that it's in. And crystals work well for that, and salt bowls, or yeah, just bowls of salt will work well for that. You can put all that negativity in the salt and then disperse it outside. You know, we do traditional cleansings with sage sometimes or other things. Salted water around the house just works really well for getting rid of negative things. I don't think I've ever had to do an exorcism of a house because I don't think we've ever lived in a haunted house other than the one I lived in college. Like the house that we live in now, we're absolutely certain that it's not haunted, which is sort of disappointing because it might be cool to have a haunted house. Um, but I do know that we've had people with. I don't want to say that people get cursed, but there's this woman in our local area who doesn't like me, and I shook her hand at a birthday party because I was trying to play nice. And for like 2 weeks, a lot of really bad shit started happening to my wife and I. So we thought maybe she had done something, so we did some magic to dissipate all of that negativity and things.
Huh. Daily
You know, I,
cleansing.
I do think witches are really Yeah, I do think witches are really good at dealing with these things. I mean, just preparing a ritual space requires a certain amount of cleansing.
Mhm.
I mean, if you have a ritual space and you decide I'm just gonna cast my circle here or open the gates or whatever it is, and there's a bunch of bad energy in that space, and bad energy can come from all kinds of things. It can come from having a bad day at work. We all have had those, and we come in, and then that bad energy just follows us around or ends up in a spot. And it's sort of like putting a drop of ink in a glass of water. That ink doesn't just fall to the bottom, it dissipates and spreads out throughout the water. So instead of a clear glass of water with a speck at the bottom, you have like a gray cup of water. And I think that's what negative energy does. So it's really important to make sure that you always get rid of it before ritual.
Mm, yeah,
And most of us are good at that.
that's a good point. I think most witches probably are good at that. Um, before we get to the Patreon section of the interview, I'm curious. There's bound to be someone who's really curious about witchcraft, or maybe saw your name on the show and thought this is going to be the guy that introduces me to all of this, and they don't know where to go from here. So, what would you tell someone like that who wants to start learning witchcraft all on their own, or just start pursuing that path? What sort of resources do you recommend they seek? And more importantly, even sometimes, what do you say they should ignore?
I think the most important thing is to do it. I think a lot of people worry too much about reading all of this and making sure they're doing it right. The best way to learn how to do things is by trial and error. So I think it's important to just really hit the ground running and do as much witchcraft as you can. Make sure that what you're doing resonates with you. I don't believe that there are absolutes in witchcraft, meaning I don't think that there are ways that you absolutely have to do anything. The only absolute is what works for you. If this particular practice works for you, then you should go with it. If you're reading a book and it says to do something and that doesn't resonate with you or make sense to you, then you probably shouldn't do it. You should try something else. I mean, I think it's great to read as much stuff as you possibly can. There are a lot of books that are good. There are also a lot of books that are bad. There's a lot of internet resources out there. There are a lot of blogs. I'm partial to the blogs at Patheos Pagan because I run Patheos Pagan, but I mean there are good ones outside of that too. So there are a lot of sources. Read as much as you can, but do the stuff. I mean, you're not going to learn to get good at magic unless you're doing magic. I feel like I was really lucky when I started out as a witch because I spent my first couple of years all by myself. I didn't have anybody else coaching me through things. I didn't have anybody else to talk to. All I had were a handful of books and my will to do these things. So I just started doing them and I figured out very quickly what works for me and what doesn't work for me. And my magic was really effective without talking to anybody else. When I moved to Michigan from Missouri, I worked at a grocery store and there was a sex offender who came into our store and he was really icky and I looked really young for my age, so he like was really interested in me, and it was just one of those people that you're around and it just feels gross. And I was like, how do I fix this problem? And I came up with a spell that I called make myself invisible, and that when I was there, he just wouldn't see me. And after I did that spell, I could walk right by him, and he wouldn't talk to me or acknowledge my existence. It was really great, and I didn't have to talk to somebody else to do that. I just figured out how to do it by working on my own for a few years and doing the magic and practicing. So I think that's the most important part. And you don't need a bunch of tools to do magic. All you need is your brain and some free time and maybe a little bit of privacy. I think we sometimes put way too much emphasis on tools, and you don't have to wait for a particular phase of the moon. If you need magic in your life, you should just go ahead and do it, and do it sooner rather than later.
Excellent advice. Agreed on all points, too. Well said. We've come to the end of the regular part of the show, Jason. So if there's something that I should have asked or something you'd like to talk about that I didn't cover, now's the time to do it.
No, you think you covered it all. I got to plug my books. I got to talk about, I got to talk about what I do. I can't think of much else. I love the questions that weren't asked, so that's really great.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Where can people find you?
The Patheos Pagan one is sometimes things that people will talk to me about. And I always love the podcasts where they don't bring that up at all.
Yeah, everybody knows to find you there, and I'll make sure they do in show notes. And with that said, again, where can people find you?
So I'm online at the blog Raise the Horns, and it's a Patheos Pagan blog. If you just type in Raise the Horns, you'll find it. If you just type in Jason Mankey, I'm really easy to find. There are, I think, 4 Jason Mankeys in the world, but I come up in like the first page all the time and usually the top thing, so I'm super easy to find. Though I feel bad for one of the Jason Mankeys who's apparently a Christian preacher.
Oh, that's his own fault.
Tough luck, buddy. That's right.
Everybody send that other Jason Mankey an invitation to join witchcraft, and maybe one day we'll save his soul.
Yeah. Poor dude.
Yeah.
Poor dude.
Well, that's a wrap on this episode of Weird Web Radio. Thank you again for everyone that is tuned in and everyone that's listening. Thank you, Jason, again for being part of the show. We really appreciate you taking the time. If you want to hear the extended interview portion where we're going to get a little bit weirder and dig in even deeper on some of the things that are part of Jason's practice and his life and his view of the world, you're going to have to go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. Thank you for being here. Stay weird, my friends. All right, Jason, we are in bonus audio time. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Let's
Let's do the thing. All right. Without any further ado, what famous person's resting place do you most want to visit? Do you want to hear how they just answered that question? What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit? That and many others, including what they think about the afterlife, what they may or may not do in cemeteries, what are their traditions, magical practices that have to do with the dead, folklore that surrounds their homes, and so much more, available for only $5. $5 a month. Even if I make more than one episode in a month, it's still just $5 a month at patreon.com/weirdwebradio or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. You can find me on Instagram at weirdwebradio. You can find me on Facebook as Weird Web Radio, or come join the new, fun, and exciting Weird Web Radio Facebook group. Thank you again for being here. Stay weird out there, my friends.